So here's what I'm going to do today. I'm not going to give a talk with isotopic data. There's no trace element data. There's no genetic model for ore deposits. Here's what I want to do today, if I do nothing else. We as geoscientists, broadly, no matter what field we study, we have to start doing a better job of communicating who we are and the value we add to society. We often get relegated to some not even back burner. We're in the back of the cupboard. And when you look at the title here, Resources for Carbon Neutrality, a geologist thinks of carbon neutrality differently than an environmentalist might, right? An environmentalist thinks of carbon neutrality, as I'll show you, as electrify everything, no more fossil fuels. And I say that's fantastic. I support that 100%. How are we going to do that? We have to have the resources in order to build that infrastructure. And this gets left out of conversations by Merkel and AOC and Biden, who come up with great plans, but often come across as thinking you can go to Walmart and on the back aisle, you can simply pull off the shelf all of the renewable energy infrastructure that we need to build. We can't do that. And the critical thing that people miss is that in the world of mining, and some of you, I know I'm preaching to the choir, there is a significant delay between when a company looks for a deposit that contains copper, finds that deposit, mines that deposit, and makes that copper available to society. So when we talk about carbon neutrality, achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, China by 2060, India by 2060 or 2070, we don't currently have enough metals in the ground that we have found that at today's market price we could extract to build that infrastructure. So we need more mining. And we as a group need to do a better job communicating this. And in Michigan, I've done this by teaching classes to the masses. I teach classes that have no prereqs and draw students from all over the university, the majority of whom come from the humanities and social sciences. And that is my only goal in that entire course, is to tell a story where geologists play the critical role. So that's what I want to do today. And I'm happy to share these slides with anybody who wants them for any purpose. So one of the classes I teach, this is where I start. And I'll ask you, where did the Industrial Revolution begin? What country? In Britain. Why did it begin in Britain? It began in Britain because of a very small number of factors. One, there was an abundance of coal that outcropped at the surface. So humans literally tripped over that coal. Coal has a higher energy density on a per mass basis than wood. So if you combust coal, you get more energy out of that reaction than you do if you combust wood. That's shown up here on the top right, okay? The other reason that the Industrial Revolution started in England is at the time, England was the only country in the world where you could patent intellectual property. No other country allowed you to do that. So in 1712, when Thomas Newcomen invented and initially ideated what we now think of as the steam engine, he patented that intellectual property and owned that. And he has a diagram, 1712, that Britain said, you own this, and anybody else who wants to make a steam engine has to pay you a royalty. We also had boredom, right? Why did Newton discover calculus? Because a Black Plague ran through Europe, including Britain, which forced him to leave Woolthorpe, the private school he attended, and live in the country, and he was bored. And boredom plays a role in this in a way that I'll show you in a few minutes. So geologists played a really special role because it was geologists that figured out how you could actually mine coal below the surface. And it was Thomas Newcomen and then James Watt who perfected the steam engine. Why did they do that? To de-water underground mines. That was the only purpose for the steam engine. It was that we exhausted all of the coal at the surface. As we mined deeper below the surface, we hit the water table. In order to move that water table out of your way, you had to de-water, and that's why the steam engine was invented. Geologists played a critical role. And that steam engine invented for mining, we adapted that to become a loom. We started mass producing fabrics, and I know there are negative things that came out of this, but all of that is viewed as technological progress. So coal took off. And when you look at where the Industrial Revolution happened in England, it wasn't random. It was very specific. Pretty quickly after coal took off, we see the growth of oil. And why did oil take off? Two reasons. One, people like Benjamin Silliman Jr., who was a professor of chemistry at Yale University, he figured out that if you took oil and you heated it up, you could distill and fractionate the various hydrocarbons in that oil. And among those hydrocarbons is petrol or diesel or jet fuel. And Henry Ford said, hey, wait a minute, that can be used in a combustion engine and I'm going to mass produce it. And everybody wanted that. Okay. Then Churchill came along. What did Churchill do? Does anybody know why Churchill is important for oil? And there's always bad, but why was Churchill important for oil? 1909 was when the first oil was discovered in Iran by a British explorer. And in 1914, Churchill, in order to ensure that the naval vessels being used by the British were superior to the naval vessels used by the Germans, Churchill ordered that all of the English naval fleet be converted from coal to oil. The reason is coal emits a lot of soot when you combust it, so it was visible. Oil is more invisible, and oil has a much higher energy density than coal. As a result, in 1914, Churchill bought the rights to the private oil reserves in modern-day Iran, and that was the creation of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And that decision is viewed by the vast majority of military history experts. Churchill's decision is why the English Navy defeated the German Navy. That's it. They could run faster, they could run more quietly, and they couldn't be detected. And this is the birth of, quote, oil production in the Mideast. And then we see natural gas come on the scene. And if you look at old movies or you read books, we had town gas, okay? Natural gas also, very high energy density. So if you look here, simply we have wood, coal, then we go to ethanol and other fuels. Crude oil is here, diesel, gasoline or petrol, and natural gas, right? So it's that irreversible combustion reaction where you simply add oxygen, put a little energy in, and the exothermic reaction liberates a lot more energy than required to get the reaction to go. And that's what we use to power our cars as of now. And that's what we built our highway system to do. And that's what we built the more than 150,000 petrol stations in the United States and hundreds of thousands more around the world to do. And it radically changed society. So this is Fifth Avenue, New York City, 1900. If you look carefully, there's one combustion engine in the picture. Does anybody see it? Right here, there's no horse. Now, New York City at the time, among the public health nightmares was the fact that horses defecate. All of these horses defecated a lot, and that caused all of the bacteria and viral material in their fecal matter to get into groundwater supplies. So you regularly had dysentery and other diseases that literally ran through humans in the area. And at the time, there were 100,000 people employed making buggies and harnesses, right? So the seed here is, at that time, 1900, 100,000 of us in America, we got up Monday to Friday. Actually, it was a 6-day work week. We got up Monday to Saturday, and we would go and we would make horses and buggies. Nobody makes horses and buggies today because today we all drive vehicles, right? So what geologists have to do is also contextualize that job shifts, major economic shifts, have been part of humanity going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. The invention of the combustion engine, if you translate that into feeding the masses, You can compare here how quickly we can farm and extract wheat with a modern day combine. In 6 minutes, I can do the same work in a combine that it took 25 men dawn to dusk to do 100 years ago, right? 25 men all day, I can do it in 6 minutes. So what happened? What were the positive results? Global population boomed because we could grow a lot more food on much smaller areas. So the yield per unit space increased. Now, I know that led to issues. We certainly have problems, but when we look at correlation here, we see global population go up, fossil fuel consumption go up, and that also had the effect of increasing gross domestic product for most countries around the world. And I know that gross domestic product, economists will say it's not a perfect metric to evaluate the economy, but it's a pretty standard way of evaluating economic productivity. And again, we see this perfect correlation. Consumption of fossil fuels went up, food production increased, global population increased, and economic prosperity on average increased selectively in some countries, but filtered out around the world. As a result, life expectancy has doubled. I mean, you got to sit back and think about that. Life expectancy in 100 years has literally doubled. So I just turned 50. 100 years ago, I'd be at my death age, right? Now, people did live to be 60, 70, 80, 90. But life expectancy doubled in 100 years. Maternal mortality has plummeted. If you go back 100, 200, 300 years, on average, depending on where you are in the world, 1 out of 3 to 1 out of 4 women died giving childbirth. Died. There was no anesthesia. There was no cesarean section. It was only in the 1870s when Ignaz Semmelweis in Austria figured out that doctors in a hospital in Austria would dissect dead bodies in the morning and deliver babies in the afternoon. And he figured out the reason that the women would die after the doctors would manipulate their vaginas to give birth is because he was taking bacteria from the dead corpses and transplanting them in the women's private parts. He was ridiculed and in fact committed to an insane asylum and beaten to death by guards. That was the 1870s, right? Today, if you give birth, maternal mortality rates are close to zero. And as a result, child mortality rates are close to zero, right? Why do you read that some people had 8, 10, 12, 15, 20 kids? Because if you had the body that could give birth to multiple children, you had a lot of children. That's because a majority of women could not. We look at vehicles, right? I showed you those the two slides, 1900 to 1913. We drive now so many more miles than we could have imagined 100 years ago, and we have far fewer fatalities because we have ideated and invented ways of keeping us safe. Airbags throughout the car, seat belts, right? We have crumple zones in cars. We work less as a result. Hard to imagine, but we work a lot less now in terms of the total number of hours than we did. I mentioned the number of people we've put out of work that used to make horses, but they wouldn't make horses. I guess you could technically, right? Horses are made by insemination, so somebody's making a horse. There were also on the order of 200,000 blacksmiths throughout Europe and the United States. Those jobs are gone, right? This is one of my favorite paintings from the Baltimore Museum of Art on the Johns Hopkins campus in Baltimore, right? And it's meant to convey the end of one type of economy and the beginning of another, right? So we see that 100 years ago. We don't see people making these the way they did. What are some other positive outcomes? Compare the top and bottom here for literacy rates, right? 1909, first oil production in modern day Iran, all of the Middle East. 1914, what we can think of as BP is founded. Fast forward to today, and what do we see? We see an increase in the penetration and availability of education throughout these fossil fuel-rich producing countries. And if you look at the top, the literacy rate for people who are over the age of 65, compare that to the bottom, the literacy rate of people today in high school and college. It's literally been flipped. And that is, I think most people would agree, a positive outcome of economic prosperity in these countries on average. Now, this one I'll build out in a couple of slides, okay? So on the left y-axis, we have hours of housework per week that we would work. On the right axis is the percentage of households engaged in housework. And then the bottom axis is time. This is access to electricity, right? 1894 at the Chicago World's Fair, there was a string of 100,000 light bulbs that the United States President Grover Cleveland flipped a switch. In the darkness, everything was illuminated. And everybody said, I want that, because it made its way into newspapers around the world. And we see access to electricity in the US is now 100%. Now, I'll be the first person to admit, as a kid who grew up and my mom missed a few electric bills, and I can remember that power being turned off, there are issues, but access is 100%. What do you think the red line is? The red line is how many hours a week we work at home, not your job. This would be going back in time when we can think of living a subsistence lifestyle. Imagine having none of these, no vacuum cleaner, no washer, no dryer, no microwave, no gas oven. Imagine if you had to wake up and go outside and use the bathroom somewhere in the backyard, right? Imagine if you had no hot water that you just magically turned on and there it is. So we see over the last 100 years, access to electricity has gone from 0 to 100%. Humans have ideated all of these electric technologies that have made our lives different. I don't want to say they've made our lives easier. They've made our lives different than they were then. And that's a radical change in only 100 years. And if I tie that back to here, both of these, all of the colors correspond to these colors on the right, from Brazil down to Vietnam. The x-axis is time on the left. The y-axis on the left is percent electrified. So if you look at each of these countries, you can see they went from 0% electricity to 100% electricity within the last century. And if you look at the right, we have the same percent electrified on the y-axis, but look at economic productivity. And again, we have poor people. Absolutely. But a couple of hundred years ago, everybody was poor. Everybody was dirt poor except for the very few elite. Everybody lived a subsistence lifestyle. Everybody wiped with their left hand. Everybody peed outside. That was life for everybody, everywhere, all the time. And with economic prosperity as a result of geology, blessing some countries with resources, we now see, when we look at something called the Human Development Index, we see that countries that consume more power, now in this case, that translates to fossil fuel power, countries that consume more power have a higher Human Development Index. There's a correlation. It's not perfect, but there's a correlation. So consumption of fossil fuels, consumption of power, longer life expectancy, more time to ideate through boredom, new technologies that give us more time to do other things. Right? If you went back to 1850 and told somebody that France has a 35-hour work week, they would have laughed. Right? That would have been something in a sci-fi thriller, right? And people would have laughed when they read that. So are there negative consequences of prosperity? Absolutely, right? It's really simple to do what I've done here, where over the time period 1775 through today, you can look at all of the black and gray lines, which represent fossil fuel combustion. It's a simple mass balance. Carbon plus oxygen equals CO2. You can calculate, based on all of the oil and natural gas and coal that humans have combusted, how much carbon we have titrated into the atmosphere. And that's the red line. All right? And it's really easy. I've never found a student, I don't care who they pray to, if they pray, don't care what political party they belong to or if they belong They all accept this. It's really simple science. And with all of that carbon, as we see up top, we see an increase in global average surface temperatures, without a doubt, right? We know that at the end of the last ice age, we went into a natural warming period, without a doubt. But over the last 200 to 300 years, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and since humans started combusting fossil fuels at much faster rates than at any point in human history, we see CO2 levels and methane levels go higher in the atmosphere, and it correlates to higher temperatures. There's no other way to explain it. And even the oil industry knows this. So this is a plot from an internal secret report that was finally leaked by Exxon scientists in 1982. The y-axis is atmospheric carbon in parts per million. The x-axis is time, 1960, 1980, 2000, 2020. Here we be. And what the Exxon scientists did is say, well, gee golly, this is a pretty easy mass balance problem. If we extrapolate into the future, how many people will drive vehicles and how many people will fly on airplanes and how many ships will use bunker fuel, we can calculate how much CO2 will get into the atmosphere. Their prediction is absolutely accurate. It's phenomenal how science works, isn't it? So this is Exxon. This isn't Greenpeace. This is Exxon forecasting exactly the CO2 levels that we now measure as a result of the consumption of coal and oil and natural gas as the dominant sources of energy / power for humans, and has led to Michael Mann and many other really good climate scientists coming up with what they call the hockey stick, where we've got the handle of the hockey stick here. For 1,000 years, temperatures kind of went, boop, 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 didn't change much. And all of a sudden, at and following the Industrial Revolution, temperatures just skyrocketed. And there's no way to explain that with natural causes. No way. Milankovitch cycles don't come close. The only way to explain this is by the absorption of re-radiated energy. Shortwave energy comes in from outer space, gets absorbed into all of our surfaces. It's re-radiated as long-wave energy. CO2 molecules, water molecules, and methane molecules absorb that energy, trap it, and we have global warming. Now, this is where I lose most of my Republican students. And I know they're Republican because I read body language, all right? Or I know their parents vote Republican because I read body language, all right? And I vote both ways. I'm a swinger, all right? So Republicans now are lost because they think I'm going to try and just nail them on you're bad human beings because you elected Donald Trump. Don't care about that, all right? Here's why Republicans care. Because when we look at these temperature increases around the world, and they are truly global in scope, right, in scale, what do we see as the tangible impacts that individual humans in states that vote Republican most of the time physically see with their eyes? Go to the state of Georgia. State of Georgia is the peach state. Georgia Bulldogs just whipped Alabama to win the NCAA tournament. It's not a tournament, is it? NCAA FBS football championship, whatever it's called. I don't really watch. Although it was nice to see Alabama lose. In any event, in Georgia, the peach yield every year goes down and down. It's going down. Why? Because if you look at the data on the right, in order for fruit trees to produce fruit, temperatures in the winter have to be cool enough in a sweet spot. If they don't get to that cold sweet spot, peach trees don't produce peach fruit. Same is true for apples in Michigan and cherries. So Georgia peach farmers, they care about increasing temperatures because their peach yields are going down. I don't have to mention climate change or Biden or rail against fossil fuels. When I travel around the state of Michigan and people talk about how great it is in the fall that they can take their little kids and they can go and pick apples, those farmers, this resonates with them because this is what puts money in their bank account. This is what we have to do. We as a group of geoscientists have to move beyond the blame game, and we have to teach climate change in a way that resonates with everybody. And we don't do that. I'll tell you, damn Skippy at the University of Michigan, we don't do that. It's like a big echo chamber, and it's really sad because it is simply increasing polarization. You see the same thing in the Midwest, right? We call it America's breadbasket, not for my grandkids. Those same temperature changes, right? Nothing to do with the Ogallala Aquifer. Those temperature changes are moving the entire wheat belt and corn belt and soybean belt north. So in 50 to 75 years, Canada's going to be where we have America's breadbasket. That resonates with farmers because they're concerned about their ability to produce wheat yields and corn yields and soybean yields. And we're seeing in real time farms in Oklahoma and Arkansas and Kansas planting cotton now. Cotton wasn't viable when Granddaddy farmed, but it's viable now. And we see it everywhere. It's not just US. So this is just a map where red is bad. Everywhere that's red means crop yields relative to now will decrease as population increases. So the question I ask peach farmers in Georgia, apple farmers in the sticks in Michigan, right, corn farmers in Nebraska, is there a way to stop this? Right? Is there a magic pill? Right? Is there something we can do? And the answer is absolutely. This is carbon neutrality, packaged in a way that resonates with people who are feeling the negative economic impact of global warming temperatures. But what does it actually mean? Right? This is what carbon neutrality means, what it requires is #electrify everything. No combustion engines whatsoever, except for airplanes, because they're not going to fly on batteries or nuclear, okay? But possibly biofuels. It means that everybody drives a battery electric vehicle. All of our buses are battery electric vehicles. Everything is electrified. All of our electricity has to come from a renewable source. No coal, no oil, no natural gas. So everybody gets to drive a Tesla. Wouldn't that be nice? All right. So I do. That was my 50th birthday present to myself. And it was also, for those of you not yet married, talk about that with your spouse before you do it. Here's what a geologist sees when I look at a Tesla, right? I see a beautiful vehicle. And yes, Elon Musk, I can criticize him too, right? But I see a beautiful vehicle that, God, I wish I'd bought it when it was $8 a share. Sweet Jesus, I wouldn't be here. Maybe I would. Now, hell no, I wouldn't. There's no way, right? Be a bazillionaire, okay? I see all the metals that make that possible. All the copper, all the boron, all the titanium, all the bauxite from which we extract aluminum. I look at the interior and I see all the rare earth metals. Why is the DOE interested in funding the research here? Because these rare earth metals, they are critical for the production of not only battery electric vehicles, but wind turbines that produce the electricity where the electron charge is pushed into these battery electric vehicles. You strip away the body, you've got 7,000 lithium ion cells inside a Tesla. But lithium ion batteries aren't just lithium. Like lithium ion batteries, we also have to produce aluminum. We have to produce nickel and cobalt and carbon. All of those are geological resources. If we look at copper alone, a current car, combustion engine vehicle, depending on make and model, let's call it 20 to 50 pounds of copper. A Tesla, 183 pounds of copper. That's a lot of copper, right? That's a factor of 3 to 6, 8? It's a lot of copper. Where is it going to come from? And it's not just copper. We need more graphite, nickel, lithium, manganese, cobalt, aluminum in the vehicle and also the battery. We need rare earth elements for all the magnets. That's why DOE wants to fund you all here, because you're among the only places in the US doing any research that's practically relevant for society. Now, take a deep swallow if that offended you, but Okay? So again, what does a geologist see? The average person sees solar panels. I see all the metals that are required to make them. The average person sees a wind turbine. I see all the metals required to make them. Single commercial scale wind turbine, 4,000 kilograms of copper, 4 tons of copper. So my Tesla's got 183 pounds of copper. One wind turbine, 1.5 megawatt capacity, give or take what we would need for a small number of Teslas. Every one of them's got 4 tons of copper. Then we look at all of the materials in the cars I just said. Now, again, this is where I'm like, oh, am I losing the Republicans? Do I have the Democrats with me? Why is this going to happen? It's going to happen fundamentally because of economics. If we look everywhere in the world today, right, and yes, there's variability, the cheapest way to build a new power plant is to build a new power plant that runs on renewable energy. Some combination of wind and solar. Now, battery storage kicks that up a bit, but it's pretty well close to being able to keep the cost of renewable solar and wind cheaper than natural gas. So if you were going to write a business plan to build a new power plant, you wouldn't build a natural gas power plant. You wouldn't build a coal-fired power plant. In fact, coal-fired power plants right now, nobody will fund them. Not even China will fund them. You build a renewable energy power plant, and everybody wants this. If you look at public opinion surveys in the United States, Republicans favor renewable energy infrastructure, increasing it, and Democrats. And we see this. This is a map of the US where if you're a bleeding heart Democrat, this is your oh shit moment. Because these colors and numbers correspond to the percent electricity generated 100% by renewable energy in each of these states. And it ain't Massachusetts, right? It's not New York. It's not states that we think of as really blue. California has a lot. But I'm highlighting here, when people think about renewable energy as somehow being in direct opposition of the Republican ideal, that's a false narrative. Everybody in the Midwest is allowing renewable energy infrastructure to be built because it's cheaper. And everybody loves cheaper. If my electric bill can go down or my electric bill, the rate increase will be lessened, I want that. So states like Iowa, last year Iowa generated almost 60% of their electricity from wind. Those farmers, we might have Tucker telling us they don't like renewable energy. Bullshit. You go to these states and you ask people, they're totally on board with this. Why else? It's American made, it's resiliency, it's the elimination of imports. Again, everything the Republican Party cherishes. And this is my wife getting out of our Tesla here on the lower left. I made that as a solo decision, but she ain't mind. She don't mind when I say that, all right? So, I thought it would play, yeah. So at the end of the day, when Alicia drives home, she jumps out of the car, and this is all she has to do. It's plugged into a 120 volt outlet in our garage. We don't have a fast charger. We don't need one, right? We drive on average 5 miles a day. At the University of Michigan, the average faculty member has a 13-mile daily commute. No, the average staff member, 13 miles. The average faculty member is 6. So the only time we've ever gone to a fast charger is if we're going to drive to Chicago, Cincinnati, or Pittsburgh, which are 1 charge away, right? Now, think about what that does for you, right? Now, I'm going to plant a seed that's going to forever bother you, and this is going to hopefully motivate you to buy an electric car. Do you ever go to the gas station and you pull that pump out and you put it in? Think about how disgusting that pump is. It's not made of copper, right? Copper is a natural antimicrobial, as is silver. Think about now how many people you've seen them picking their nose when they drive, scratching the nether parts, and then they grab that handle. That's on your hands. We don't ever go to the gas station, and Alicia has never come home and said, Adam, I really regret it. I was dying today to leave work and have to go to a gas station to sit there for 15 minutes to pump gas into my car. Doesn't happen. That's my backyard, DIY. I built this last year. Those are batteries in my basement. If in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I can build this and go off the grid, it can be done everywhere. Everywhere. So where do we get all these metals? Well, lucky for us, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, just past the organic apple orchard, are solar panel trees. All right. I have had students actually believe me on that one. And then I really want to go to the University of Michigan admissions office and say, how smart are these kids? Anyway, we got to mine them. That's where they come from, right? And there used to be a saying called, if you can't grow it, you got to mine it. That's over, because everything we grow today, we've got to mine the resources to grow what we grow, right? When we grow things, what do? We fertilize them with sulfur. We fertilize them with phosphorus. We fertilize them with potassium. Where does all that come from? We mine it. So everything is mined today. And again, when I look at this beautiful hole in the ground just southwest of Salt Lake City, since 1890, that hole in the ground has produced 22 million tons of copper. And when I flip on a light switch or I put my charger into the Tesla, that's what I see. I see chalcopyrite on the other end of that electricity. This is not new. The Old Testament describes the metals of antiquity, put us on the map in the animal kingdom, took us from the Stone Age to the Copper Age to the Bronze Age. Humans found copper like this in places such as northern Michigan, Central and South America, other parts of North America, right? We go to places like Great Orme in England. Humans dug these tunnels that run miles into the rocks. Why did they dig these tunnels? Because they saw this beautiful green patina that we now know is an immediate indicator of copper rock or copper mineralization in that rock, right? Humans did this, and this kicked off the Copper Age. Also created new trade routes. The Romans, among the reasons they wanted control of England, they wanted the copper. This is a copper ingot mined in England, shipped back to Italy. Then what happened? Then we made copper tools. Copper tools, rock, paper, scissors. Guess what? If I have a stone and you have a copper spear, I'm going to fucking run because you're going to kill me. Right? That led to new empires. Then we had a Bob, what's the guy's name with happy accidents? Bob Ross. We had a happy accident, and it had to have been an accident, right? Happy accident where somebody figured out that copper that had made us move into the Copper Age, if you mix copper, okay, about 8 or 9 parts copper with 1 to 2 parts tin, you lower the melting temperature from the high temperature end member copper, you can make bronze. Guess what? Rock, paper, scissors. If you've got a copper sword and I've got a bronze sword, you better fucking run, because I'm going to win. And it put the Assyrian Empire on the map. Completely changed the politics of the Middle East, because the Assyrian Empire grew as a result of inventing bronze. And this is what I see when I look at maps of the ancient Middle East, where we've got all of these places, and every one of them became a place because we could trip over copper, we could trip over tin, we could trip over gold. Put places on the map and set up trade routes. The Silk Road did not follow its path willy-nilly. And among the reasons the Silk Road followed its specific path in what is now modern Anatolia is the mines. And this is mining today. It's on steroids. In a couple of hundred years since the Industrial Revolution, think about our lives today relative to 1700, 1750. I can promise you, I have yet to meet somebody who truly wants to go back when you actually tell them what that would mean, giving up what we have today. And it continues to change us. This is Shanghai, 1987. This is 2013. What do I see when I look at Shanghai? I see year over year, we as humans consume about 300 to 500% more iron ore today than we did in 1960. When I look at copper, behind all of these light fixtures, copper here, copper inside my laptop up on the stage, I see humans that use 350% more copper now every year than we did in 1960. And for a long time, it was easy, right? We literally tripped over outcrops. The Industrial Revolution, coal outcropped at the surface. You literally saw it with the naked eye, right? We tripped over it. And then we started going underground. Thomas Newcomen invented the steam engine, dewater the mines, but it's getting harder. So these next few slides are simply meant to convey that we no longer trip over ore deposits, which for some of you in the room is already intuitive. We don't trip over them anymore. They're getting harder to find because as the axes show you here, the y-axis is depth from 0 down. The x-axis is time, 1900 through today. These are the depths of ore deposits that we're finding now. They're deeper, buried under more cover, more soil, more regolith, right? More alluvium, more quaternary color, right? That was the easiest thing in field camp to map, wasn't it, Andy? It's like, God, this is just a bunch of shitty sediment. No offense if you're a sedimentologist. And it was just yellow everywhere on the map. It was so easy. You find the outcrops, you map the outcrops, and everything else, you just say, okay. And then you invent the cross sections. I did learn a lot in that field camp, right? So buried under cover means harder to find. On average today, if we look at global ore deposits, they're buried under about 178 meters of cover. And if you look from the 1950s to today, they're getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Still mineable, but harder to find. This is just copper for the period bottom axis 1900 through 2020, depth from 0 down to 3,000 meters or 3 kilometers. And you can see that there are some that are close to the surface. They don't outcrop at the surface, but they're close, but they're getting deeper. The easy ones have been found and we're tapping out. So now we have to use a variety of sophisticated geophysical techniques like X-ray vision to look into that cover using airborne techniques. And I'm not going to go into any of these details. I'm sure Bill Chavez teaches a class on this. But this is just an example where simply look at the colors and we can use a variety of techniques to measure gravity. We can use resistivity to measure electrical conductivity and flow. And then we can see what's below the surface. It's more expensive. So the only number you need to take away on this slide is that between 2009 and 2018, the average cost that a mining company incurred to discover a new deposit was $185 million. $185 million. That's just to discover the deposit. You haven't yet built the mine infrastructure and started shoveling out the ore and beneficiating the ore physically and chemically so that you can produce copper cathode to sell on the open market. That's per deposit. And as a result, if you only focus on the right side over here, the number of discoveries is decreasing year over year. That's not a good thing for carbon neutrality. So we're spending more money and we're finding fewer deposits. And what makes this really challenging is this is a graphic for what we call a capital intensive operation. And here's all I want you to see. Follow my cursor. If we start out right here, me and Andy go out. You still have that old Jeep? Me and Andy go out in the old Jeep and we're going to ride off into the desert. And we've borrowed money from Phil Candela because he retired early. So he wants to have a lot of cash if he can retire that early. And Mary's still working. So that's, he's got his sugar mama at home now. Anyway, we're borrowing money, finding the deposit, investigating the deposit, building the infrastructure, permitting. And then we start mining. All of that money's borrowed. Borrowing money is getting harder and harder and harder. So if we look at this, all I want you to take away is that from the time Andy and I left in our Jeep, his Jeep, so co-opted it there to say our Jeep. I'll send you my address if you want to bequeath that to me.
Paid you for your testing.
If we start out to here, these are interest rates. So one of the things that you observe in mineral economics is that if I want to mine in a country that's perceived as dangerous, it costs me a lot of money to borrow the money to do the mining. So it's getting more expensive, okay? And on average, it takes 16 years from the time I find a deposit to the time I produce a metal from the deposit. 16 years. Now that's the average. Some are a few years, some are 20, 30, 40 years, right? So all I want you to see here is every country on earth in the blue the whole United Nations, they claim by 2050 they're going to be carbon neutral, which means we need all those metals. So is it possible to do this? Is it possible to electrify everything? Well, we've done big projects like this in the past. The Empire State Building literally built in 410 days, including the permitting and the environmental permits. You imagine that today? You can't build an effing garage in 410 days in Ann Arbor without 7 people coming out who oftentimes, I'm not sure they know how to wash their hands, and they want to evaluate everything you want to do on the project. Okay, so we've done this. We've done this. But now we need to mine 2 to 3 times more copper than we've mined since the dawn of the Copper Age. That's a lot of copper. And this slide is simply meant to say copper grades are getting lower. So if you look at the data here, the x-axis is the percent of copper in a rock. If we go back a couple of 100 years, those copper deposits we tripped over, boy, were they juicy. They were super juicy. Today, there's very little copper in that ore. We're mining copper with 0.1 weight percent, 0.3 weight percent, 0.5 weight percent. So again, more expensive. So when we look at copper, there's a supply shortage. Right now, if we wanted the Green New Deal to become reality, we can't do it. We can't do it. That's what this conveys here, supply shortage. The red line is how much copper currently, based on mines that are operating and permitted, how much copper will be produced by 2028. The black line is how much we need. See, the same thing for lithium, supply shortage. Okay? We don't have the metals to make carbon neutrality a reality. And all I want to highlight on this slide is if you follow my cursor for copper, right here, 0.6, the y-axis is supply over demand. Anything below 1 means that the forecasted supply will not meet demand. So how do we remedy that? How do we achieve carbon neutrality? We have to have a complete mindset change. And when I say we, I mean we in more developed countries. We have to stop using less developed countries as the source of our metals, where environmental degradation is out of sight, out of mind. And we have to start mining the metals that we want in more developed countries. And the beneficiaries will also be lesser developed countries. We have to go to places like the Pebble Project in Alaska, okay? Complete remote Alaska, where geologists have done exploration. They've used a variety of airborne techniques and helicopters and planes to look below the surface with X-ray vision. They have found lots of hydrothermal magnetite that they can identify from the geophysical surveys. And over the last 30 years, right, the details are not important. Over the last 30 years, companies have drilled into the Pebble prospect. And as of this year, they've drilled 1 million feet of drill core, 1,200 drill holes. They've put together a mine plan where this is the current surface in Alaska. They start mining on the west because you have higher grades close to the surface. So remember, you've borrowed money for 30 years. You've never made a profit. You want to extract the metals as fast as possible to pay back the interest plus the principal. So they mine from west to east out over 78 years. And if they did this, Pebble would be, if I remember correctly, the 12th biggest producing copper mine on Earth. Pebble takes us to carbon neutrality in the United States. And if you sum copper plus gold plus moly plus silver, it's the biggest ore body on the planet. The biggest ore body on the planet, domestic resource, 100% American-made, indigenous stolen. That's where it is. We don't need copper from anywhere else, right? But nobody wants to mine it because it sits upstream of pristine salmon fisheries. And if there were a mine tailings disaster, it could negatively impact the salmon fisheries. And there's no way to eliminate that risk unless you don't mine. But if you don't mine, you don't do carbon neutrality. You don't do it. You just can't. So increasingly, what we see is the growth of environmental groups that are pro-carbon neutrality and anti-mining. And you can't have both. You can't. You can't. You just can't do it. So getting the social license is hard to get. And the same groups that oppose mining here love to talk about environmental justice, but honestly don't give a rat's tush about environmental justice in Ghana or the DRC or Brazil. Oh yeah, it's sad they're cutting down the Amazon rainforest, but when they buy their salmon farmed using soy grown on chopped down rainforest land in Brazil, and they buy that from Whole Foods, somehow a miracle happened. So we have some sort of cognitive dissonance on steroids here. When we look at the lifetime of these mines, right, 16 years is the average. Pebble has been a prospect for 3 decades. If we mined it, we can be carbon neutral. Now, we need other metals, right? It's not only the metals, so we still need cobalt, right? But guess what? We in the developed world have cobalt. If you look at the history of Toronto, the Toronto Stock Exchange was built to buy and sell shares in mining companies. That's why the Toronto Stock Exchange was founded in the late 19th century. And there's a town called Cobalt, north of Toronto. Guess what they mined? They mined silver because silver was economic. We had uses for it. Cobalt was waste. There's a lot of waste just literally sitting there ready for the taking. So we have to start mining rather than offshoring the mining to developing countries. So this is a headline last year where I wake up, right, and I do have a shrink and a psychiatrist, so I am certified somewhat crazy, right? Laura's known me for a long time. You know, my wife will tell you that, right? Field camp, I was probably better behaved.
No.
Okay.
Stories later.
But I see this and I think, whoa, what do we do? Right? Like, yes, we want to protect the environment. Absolutely. Yes, we want environmental justice. Absolutely. Yes, we want to stop emitting fossil fuels. So I'll have conversations with people where they say, stop mining, we must stop mining, right? Phil Candell and I used to go and we would get sandwiches, lunch in the co-op at the Student Union on the University of Maryland's campus. They've closed now because, go figure, they adopted a non-capitalist model and went into economic decline, went bankrupt, and had to close. That's a true story. All right, capitalism can be bad, but in most cases, it's pretty good. And most granola people that I meet, they kind of like going to the hospital and having a doctor say, I can fix you. But anyway, they say stop mining. There's a cash register there. And it had this huge stop mining, and Phil would just, oh my God. And this is back when Phil was somewhat liberal, right? So this is his pre-hardcore pivot. You look at that and they're pushing the buttons. You're hearing the sounds. You're looking around at the lights. You've got a stainless steel counter. You've got the knives. You've got the truck. I'm like, stop mining. No, the question is, where do we mine? So the message that we as geologists, this is my last slide, the message that we as geologists have to do, and this is where I really call on faculty who teach classes at all levels, especially levels where you get students from all over the landscape. And when you engage with administrators, we have to start doing a better job of communicating effectively the role for geology, right? We're not simply raping and pillaging. We're not doing that, but we don't tell people that. We live in a world where if it bleeds, it leads. And everybody agrees. When there's a tailings collapse in Brazil and 228 people die, that's horrific. Absolutely horrific. But 100,000 people last year died from opioid abuse, right? 70,000 people commit suicide, right? So it ultimately does become a numbers game, and we have to get in that game and play it. And we have to start advertising to society who we are and what we do. NSF made that easier for us about 6 years ago. If you get funding from the National Science Foundation, it used to be you'd have this really technical abstract that like only me and Andy would understand, right? Like all this mumbo jumbo, like, oh, I'm going to impress Andy with all these words. Let me put elucidate in here and individuate in here. And Andy's probably like, what is this shit? But now you have to write a layman's abstract for NSF because Congress got tired of seeing money go for science that they can't see a tangible outcome. The work that we do has a tangible benefit for society. It does. In the same way that people who work in earthquake hazards, landslide hazards, they're somehow cherished. But damn Skippy, nobody's going to predict the next big earthquake in LA. It ain't going to happen. But there's gazillions of dollars being put into trying to figure out, can we predict an earthquake? All they can do is say yes. No clue when. No clue. We do work that has a tangible benefit for society. And we have to package what we do in a way that resonates with the average person. I can promise you, I grew up in North Carolina in a racially divided town. The vast majority of people that I grew up with and know are hardcore Republicans. Some of them voted for Trump because they're hardcore racist. Some of them voted for Trump because every mill in my town got shipped to China in the 1990s after NAFTA was signed into law by Bill Clinton. All right? This message resonates with them. I don't have to mention climate change. Right? I can talk about economic opportunities. That's what we have to do. And so for those of you that have any administrative power, that's what we have to start doing. Right? Take the stuff that, Alex, don't get an ego about this, but take the stuff that Alex and Nicole and now Laura is involved with. Their stuff needs to be publicized because it's tangible. Understanding how ore bodies enriched in rare earth metals form is tangible because we need those rare earth metals to make magnets, to make wind turbines spin, to generate electricity to go into a Tesla. We need it. And we don't do a good job at doing this. So if that's the one thing you take out of this is be proud of what we do as a community of geoscientists and constantly think about how do I package who I am as a scientist in a way that resonates with that audience. Because it's not a one size fits all, right? Andy and I can talk about this and we already agree, but I can have the same impact talking to somebody who is the most ardent liberal tree hugger on the planet. And I can convince them mining is necessary. And I can convince them they don't like it, but I have convinced lots of students that mining Pebble is better than mining in the DRC. You just have to communicate effectively. So thank you very much for listening.